They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But what happens when fate gives you a second chance to serve it with a side of justice? This is the story of how I went from being betrayed and left with nothing to becoming the one person my ex-husband feared most. His landlord. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Rebecca Martinez, and until 3 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life in Riverside, California. I was married to David Chen, a successful real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties throughout Orange County. We lived in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a gated community, complete with a pool, 3-car garage, and enough space for the family we planned to start. David and I met in college at UC San Diego. He was studying business while I pursued my degree in graphic design. Back then, he was charming, attentive, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. He'd bring me coffee during late-night study sessions and leave little notes in my textbooks. When he proposed during our senior year, I didn't hesitate to say yes. After graduation, we moved to Riverside where David landed his first job at a prestigious real estate firm. I started freelancing as a graphic designer, working with small businesses and startups. The money wasn't great at first, but David's career took off quickly. Within 5 years, he was one of the top agents in the area, pulling in 6-figure commissions regularly. That's when we bought our dream house on Maple Grove Avenue. It was a 3,200 square foot Mediterranean-style home, with terracotta roof tiles and a stunning view of the San Bernardino Mountain. David handled all the paperwork, and since he was the one with the steady income and real estate expertise, we put the house entirely in his name. I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? We were married, planning our future together. I threw myself into making that house a home. I spent months designing the perfect color schemes for each room, sourcing vintage furniture from estate sales, and creating a garden that would make better homes and gardens jealous. The kitchen became my sanctuary, with custom cabinets I'd painted myself and herbs growing on the windowsill. Our master bedroom had French doors that opened onto a balcony where we'd drink wine and watch the sunset. David seemed happy too, at least on the surface. He'd come home after long days showing properties, and I'd have dinner waiting. We'd talk about our days, make plans for weekend trips to San Francisco or Las Vegas. He started making even more money, taking on high-end clients who were buying multi-million-dollar estates in Newport Beach and Beverly Hills. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. It was subtle at first. David began working later, claiming he had evening appointments with international clients in different time zones. He'd get phone calls during dinner and step outside to take them. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague. Then there were the business trips. Suddenly, David was traveling to conferences and training seminars almost every other weekend. Phoenix, Denver, Seattle, always somewhere that required him to be gone for 2 or 3 days. He'd return home exhausted, barely speaking to me before collapsing into bed. I started noticing other things too. He'd changed his phone password, something he'd never done in our 7 years of marriage. New clothes would appear in his closet. Expensive shirts and suits that I didn't remember him buying. He started going to the gym religiously, something he'd never shown interest in before. The final red flag was his sudden interest in our finance. David had always handled our money, but now he was asking detailed questions about my freelance income, suggesting I might want to look into getting a more stable job. He mentioned that the real estate market was unpredictable, and we should probably start budgeting more carefully. I should have seen it coming, but love makes you blind to the obvious. I convinced myself he was just stressed about work, maybe going through some kind of midlife crisis. I suggested couples therapy, romantic weekend getaways, anything to reconnect with the man I'd married. Then came that Tuesday in March when my world collapsed. I was working from home, designing a logo for a local bakery, when David came home unexpectedly at 2 in the afternoon. He was carrying a briefcase and had that look on his face, the same expression he wore when he was about to close a difficult deal. "Rebecca, we need to talk," he said, setting his briefcase on our granite kitchen counter. I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. What's wrong? You look serious. David pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase. I've made a decision about our future. About the house. My stomach dropped. What kind of decision? I've found a buyer for the house. Someone who's willing to pay 20% above market value. We can't pass up this opportunity. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You want to sell our house? But David, this is our home. We've put so much work into it. Where would we live? I've been thinking about that, he said, not meeting my eye. Maybe this is a good time for us to take a break, figure out what we really want. The words hit me like a physical blow. A break? David, what are you talking about? Are you asking for a separation? He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before. Guilt mixed with determination. I think it would be best for both of us. I'll make sure you're taken care of financially. Of course. Your half of the house sale will give you plenty to start over? I was on my feet now, my voice rising. David, we've been married for 7 years. This is our life we're talking about, not some business transaction. Rebecca, please try to understand. I'm not happy. We're not happy. We've been going through the motions for months. I had no idea you felt that way. Why didn't you talk to me? We could have worked on things together. David shook his head. I've already signed the sale agreement. The buyers want to close next month. That's when the real truth came out. Through my tears and desperate questions, the story emerged piece by piece. There was someone else, Victoria Hawthorne, a wealthy widow from Newport Beach, who'd been looking for investment property. She was 15 years older than me, with inherited money from her late husband's tech company, Fortune. David had met her 6 months ago when she hired him to find her a vacation home in the mountains. Their professional relationship had quickly turned personal. Victoria wasn't just buying our house as an investment. She wanted David to move in with her to her Malibu mansion. I'm sorry, Rebecca. I never meant for it to happen this way, David said, but his words sounded hollow. Victoria understands me in ways that you don't. I felt like I was drowning. So you're throwing away 7 years of marriage for some rich woman you've known for 6 months? It's not that simple. It sounds pretty simple to me. You're trading me in for someone with a bigger bank account. David's face hardened. That's not fair. Victoria and I have a real connection. She's sophisticated, worldly, she's traveled everywhere, speaks 3 languages, she appreciates fine art and culture. The implication was clear. I wasn't sophisticated enough for him anymore. The small-town girl who'd supported his dreams while he climbed the social ladder had become an embarrassment. The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations and devastating discovery. Since the house was in David's name only, I had no legal claim to it despite having contributed to its upkeep and improvement for years. My freelance income was inconsistent, so I hadn't qualified for the original mortgage. Every dollar I'd spent on renovations, every hour I'd invested in making that house beautiful, none of it mattered legally. David moved out immediately, claiming he was staying at a hotel while transitioning, but I knew he was already living with Victoria in her Malibu estate. The house sale proceeded with ruthless efficiency. David had chosen buyers who could close quickly with cash. Victoria's friends from her social circle who wanted a vacation property in Riverside. Within 4 weeks I was packing my entire life into boxes. 7 years of marriage, all the dreams we'd shared, reduced to whatever I could fit in my compact Honda Civic. I'd managed to find a tiny studio apartment in a less desirable part of town, the kind of place with thin walls and a parking lot full of oil stains. The day I handed over the keys to our beautiful home was the worst day of my life. I stood in our empty living room, remembering all the dinner parties we'd hosted, the Christmas mornings by the fireplace, the quiet Sunday afternoons reading books on the couch. David wasn't even there for the final walkthrough. He'd left that to his assistant. As I drove away from Maple Grove Avenue for the last time, I felt something inside me break. But alongside the grief and betrayal, something else was growing. A cold, hard determination that David Chen would regret the day he decided I wasn't good enough for his new life. 2 years passed in a haze of rebuilding and bitter acceptance. I threw myself into my graphic design business, working 18-hour days from my cramped studio apartment. The pain of David's betrayal had calcified into something harder, a relentless drive to prove I could survive without him. My client base grew steadily. I specialized in rebranding for divorce attorneys and women's shelters, finding a strange comfort in helping other women rebuild their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me, but success felt hollow when I'd drive past my old neighborhood and see strangers living in the home I'd poured my heart into. Then on a rainy Thursday in November, everything changed. I was rushing to meet a client at a coffee shop in downtown Riverside when a delivery truck ran a red light. The impact sent my Honda spinning across the intersection. The last thing I remembered was the screech of metal and the taste of blood. I woke up in Riverside Community Hospital 3 days later. The doctors said I'd been in a coma with severe head trauma. My sister Elena flew in from Phoenix, crying as she held my hand and told me how scared everyone had been. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off, but something was different. As I lay in that hospital bed, memories started flooding back, not just from this life, but from what felt like another timeline entirely. I remembered being here before, living through this exact same betrayal, but with different choices, different outcomes. In that other life, I'd spent years consumed by bitterness, eventually dying alone and forgotten while David lived happily with Victoria. But somehow, I'd been given another chance. The accident had awakened something in me, like a cosmic reset button had been pressed. The doctors called it a miracle recovery. Within a week I was walking, talking, and thinking more clearly than I had in years. But I wasn't the same Rebecca who'd entered that intersection. I had knowledge now. Knowledge of exactly what David and Victoria were planning, what mistakes I'd made before, and most importantly, how to turn the tables. During my recovery, I did some digging. Victoria's investment portfolio was more precarious than it appeared. Her late husband's tech fortune was tied up in volatile cryptocurrency and overvalued startups. She'd been quietly liquidating assets to maintain her lavish lifestyle, including selling off properties at a loss. More interestingly, I discovered that David's real estate license was up for renewal, and there were some questionable transactions in his recent history. Nothing illegal, but enough gray areas to make the licensing board take notice if someone were to file the right complaints. But the most valuable information came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, who cleaned Victoria's Malibu house twice a week, was the sister of one of my clients. During a casual conversation, Maria mentioned how unhappy the Senora seemed lately, always arguing with her boyfriend about money and demanding he contribute more to household expenses. David, it seemed, had discovered that being a kept man came with expectations. Victoria expected him to pay for his share of their expensive lifestyle, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, weekend trips to Aspen, designer clothes befitting her social circle. His real estate commissions, impressive as they were, couldn't keep up with Victoria's spending habits. That's when I formulated my plan. Using the settlement money from my accident lawsuit against the trucking company, I quietly started acquiring properties. Not glamorous ones, small apartment buildings, modest single-family homes, the kind of unglamorous real estate that generates steady rental income. I partnered with Elena, who'd always been better with numbers, and we formed Martinez Property Management. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I knew David's patterns, his weaknesses, his timeline. In exactly 18 months, Victoria would lose a major lawsuit against her late husband's business partner. The judgment would force her to sell the Malibu house and significantly downsize her lifestyle. David, faced with the choice between supporting a suddenly less wealthy Victoria or finding his own place, would choose self-preservation. He'd start looking for rental properties in Riverside, wanting to maintain his client base while living somewhere more affordable than Malibu. I positioned myself perfectly for that moment. Over the next year and a half, I systematically bought properties in David's target areas. I knew his preferences. He'd want something modern, in a good neighborhood, with enough space to entertain clients. I purchased a sleek townhouse complex in Victoria Gardens, 3 blocks from his favorite restaurant. I bought a contemporary single-family home on Magnolia Avenue, walking distance from his gym. Every property I acquired was exactly the type of place David would choose. But I didn't stop there. I also bought the small apartment building where Victoria's housekeeper, Maria, lived. Through careful conversations, I learned about the couple's increasingly frequent fights. David had started staying out late, claiming he was working, but Maria had seen him at bars in Newport Beach with women who definitely weren't clients. Victoria, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly paranoid about her financial situation. She'd started demanding that David contribute 50% of all household expenses, despite the massive difference in their incomes. She'd also discovered his late-night activities and hired a private investigator to follow him. The relationship was imploding, right on schedule. I also leveraged my graphic design business strategically. Several of David's former colleagues became my clients, and through casual conversations I learned about his professional struggles. His sales numbers had dropped significantly since moving to Malibu. The long commute was affecting his ability to show properties during peak hours, and his new high-maintenance lifestyle left him constantly distracted. Meanwhile, I was thriving. Martinez Property Management had grown to include 12 rental properties across Riverside County. My graphic design business was booming, and I'd hired 2 assistants. I'd moved from my studio apartment to a beautiful 2-bedroom condo with mountain views. Not as grand as my former home, but entirely mine. The first crack in David and Victoria's facade came exactly when I'd predicted. Victoria lost her lawsuit in March, and the judgment was even larger than I'd anticipated. $8 million, plus legal fees. She had to sell the Malibu house immediately and liquidate most of her remaining assets. David's response was predictably selfish. Instead of supporting Victoria through her crisis, he started looking for an exit strategy. Through Maria, I learned he was already apartment hunting online, telling Victoria he needed a place closer to work, temporarily while they figured out their next move. That's when I made my first direct move. I had Elena create a fake online profile and start engaging with David on rental listing websites. Using a different name and email address, she expressed interest in viewing several properties, including 2 of mine. David, desperate to maintain his income and unaware of who his potential landlord really was, eagerly scheduled viewings. The irony was delicious. Here was the man who'd left me homeless, now begging to rent properties I owned. But I wasn't ready to reveal myself yet. This was chess, not checkers, and I had several more moves to make. The townhouse viewing went perfectly. David loved the granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and spacious layout. When Elena mentioned that the landlord was flexible on terms for the right tenant, David practically begged for an application. I approved of him immediately, of course, but the lease agreement Elena presented included some very specific clauses, ones I'd carefully crafted based on my knowledge of David's weaknesses and future behavior. There was a strict no overnight guests policy without landlord approval, a clause about maintaining professional conduct that could void the lease if violated, and most importantly, a provision that allowed for immediate eviction if the tenant was found to be subletting or using the property for unauthorized business purposes. David signed without reading the fine print. Men like him never think the rules apply to them. 3 weeks later, he moved into my townhouse. Through security cameras I'd installed, I watched him carry his belongings up the stairs, the same belongings he'd packed so hastily when he'd abandoned our marriage, the expensive suits Victoria had bought him, the watch I'd given him for our 5th anniversary, the coffee maker we'd received as a wedding gift. David Chen was now paying me $30 a month to live in a property I owned, completely unaware that his ex-wife had become his landlord. But this was just the beginning of my revenge. For 3 months, I watched David through my security system like a scientist observing a lab rat. His daily routines became predictable entertainment. Every morning at 7:15, he'd emerge from the townhouse in his expensive suits, checking his phone obsessively as he walked to his BMW. Every evening, he'd return between 8 and 10, usually carrying takeout bags from restaurants he couldn't really afford. But the most interesting developments happened on weekends. Despite the lease clearly stating no overnight guests without written permission, David began bringing women to the townhouse. Not Victoria. Their relationship had officially ended when she moved into a modest apartment in Long Beach, her Malibu mansion now owned by the bank. These were new conquests, young real estate assistants, divorced clients looking for someone to make them feel special again, occasional one-night stands from whatever bar he'd discovered in the area. Each violation was carefully documented. Photos, timestamps, even audio recordings when the security system picked up raised voices or suspicious activities. I was building an airtight case for breach of contract, but I wanted more than just legal grounds for eviction. I wanted him to understand exactly who held all the power. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Through Maria, who now worked for me, part-time managing some of my rental properties, I learned that David was struggling financially. Victoria's legal troubles had tanked his reputation among the wealthy Newport Beach clientele, guilt by association in their exclusive social circle. His commission checks had dwindled to a fraction of their former size. Worse, he'd made the mistake of trying to impress his new romantic interests with the same lavish lifestyle he'd maintained with Victoria. Expensive dinners, weekend trips to wine country, designer gifts he couldn't afford. Credit card debt was mounting, and he'd already borrowed against his BMW to make rent payments. That's when I decided to accelerate my timeline. On a Wednesday morning in July, I had Elena call David with a fictional emergency. She claimed to be calling on behalf of the property management company, explaining that there had been complaints from neighbors about unauthorized guests and potential subletting activities. The landlord wanted to schedule an immediate inspection of the property. David panicked. Exactly as I'd predicted. He begged for 24 hours to address any concerns and promised that any misunderstandings would be resolved immediately. Elena graciously agreed to schedule the inspection for Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I spent that Wednesday evening preparing for the most satisfying moment of my new life. Thursday arrived with perfect California sunshine. I dressed carefully, a tailored black business suit that projected authority. My hair pulled back in a severe bun, minimal makeup that emphasized the hardness in my eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. I looked like exactly what I'd become, a successful businesswoman who didn't tolerate being crossed. At exactly 2 o'clock, I knocked on the door of my own townhouse. When David opened it, the color drained from his face so completely, I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and he actually took a step backward into the hallway. "Hello, David," I said, stepping inside without invitation. "I believe we have an appointment to discuss some lease violations." "Rebecca, how are you here? What's going on?" I walked through the townhouse slowly, examining everything with exaggerated attention to detail. The granite countertops he'd admired so much during the viewing, the stainless steel appliances that had sealed the deal, the spacious layout that had made him so eager to sign the lease. "This is a beautiful property, don't you think? I've put a lot of work into making it perfect for the right tenant." I turned to face him, enjoying the growing panic in his eyes. "Though I have to say, I'm disappointed in how it's being maintained." David's voice came out as a whisper. "You're the landlord? Martinez Property Management, LLC. I'm the M. and Martinez." I pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through photos. "Would you like to see the documentation of your lease violations? I have quite an extensive collection." I showed him photo after photo. Different women entering and leaving the townhouse, cars parked overnight in the driveway, evidence of parties that violated the noise ordinances outlined in his lease. Each image was time-stamped and GPS tagged, creating an undeniable record of his misconduct. "I can explain. I'm sure you can. You always were good with explanations." I moved to the window, looking out at the courtyard where he parked the BMW he'd probably lose within 6 months. "Tell me, David, do you remember what you said when you sold our house about me needing to start over and figure out what I really wanted?" He remained silent, finally understanding the magnitude of his situation. "Well, I did start over. And what I wanted was to never be powerless again. To never trust someone else to take care of me. To build something that belonged entirely to me. I gestured around the townhouse. Mission accomplished, wouldn't you say? David found his voice again, though it shook. Rebecca, look, I know things ended badly between us, but this is insane. You can't just what? Own property, enforce lease agreements, conduct business in this town where I've lived longer than you have. I sat down on his couch, my couch, and crossed my legs. Actually, David, I can do whatever I want. That's what having money and property ownership allows. How did you afford all this? The question revealed everything about David's character that I'd chosen to ignore during our marriage. Even now, faced with the evidence of my success, he couldn't believe I'd achieved it without a man's help. Hard work, smart investments, and a very generous settlement from the trucking company, whose driver nearly killed me 2 years ago. I paused for effect. You probably didn't hear about the accident. You were too busy enjoying your new life to check on your ex-wife's well-being. David slumped into a chair, the full weight of his situation finally settling in. What do you want? Right now, I want you to understand something. When you left me, you thought you were trading up. A small-town graphic designer for a wealthy widow, a modest life for champagne and caviar. You discarded me like I was worthless. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, running my hand along the granite countertop. But here's what you failed to realize. I was never the liability in our relationship. You were. I made our house a home. I supported your dreams. I built a life that could have sustained us both. You threw that away for someone else's money. And now I own 12 properties across this county. I employ 8 people. I have a net worth that would make Victoria jealous if she weren't busy declaring bankruptcy. I turned to face him fully. And you, David, are homeless as of tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? But the lease you signed without reading? The one that includes immediate eviction clauses for unauthorized guests and violation of property use agreements. I pulled out an official-looking document. This is your 30-day notice to vacate. Actually, given the severity of your violations, it's more like a 12-hour notice. David's face went through several emotions. Anger, desperation, disbelief. You can't do this. There are indeed laws that protect property owners from tenants who violate their lease agreements. Laws I researched very thoroughly before I drafted that contract you signed so eagerly. I walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and David? I've purchased the apartment complex where Victoria is living now. She'll be receiving her eviction notice next week. Something about overdue rent and complaints from neighbors about her vocational activities. The last part was a lie, but David didn't know that. I wanted him to understand that his choices had consequences not just for him, but for everyone he'd involved in his selfish decisions. This is revenge, Rebecca. This is sick. This is business, and justice, and maybe a little bit of karma. I opened the door and stepped into the afternoon sunshine. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow to remove your belongings. After that, anything left behind becomes property of the landlord. I walked to my car, a brand new Tesla I'd bought with cash, and drove away without looking back. In my rearview mirror, I could see David standing in the doorway of the townhouse, finally understanding what it felt like to lose everything. 6 months later, I heard through Maria that David had moved back in with his parents in San Diego. His real estate license suspended pending an ethics investigation. Victoria had indeed been evicted, though for legitimate reasons involving unpaid rent, and was reportedly working at a department store in Orange County. As for me, I expanded Martinez Property Management into commercial real estate and opened a second office in Los Angeles. I bought a penthouse apartment with a view of the mountains and the city lights. I traveled to Europe, learned to speak Italian, and started dating a kind, successful architect who treats me like an equal partner. Sometimes I drive past the house on Maple Grove Avenue, where David and I used to live, The current owners have painted it a different color and added a playground in the backyard. It looks happy, filled with the laughter of children and the chaos of a real family. I don't miss that life anymore. The woman who lived there was naive, dependent, willing to trust someone else with her security and happiness. That woman died in a hospital bed 2 years ago, and in her place rose someone stronger, smarter, and infinitely more powerful. David taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Never give anyone else control over your fate. I took that lesson to heart, and I used it to build something he could never touch, never take away, never diminish. In the end, the best revenge wasn't leaving him homeless. It was proving that I never needed him at all. But the story doesn't end there. Because fate, it seems, has a sense of humor. 3 years after David's eviction, I received a call that would complete the circle in ways I never imagined. My lawyer, Jessica Kim, contacted me about an unusual opportunity. The original house on Maple Grove Avenue, our former dream home, was going into foreclosure. The buyers who had purchased it from David had been using it as a rental property, but poor management and a series of problem tenants had left them financially underwater. They were desperate to sell, willing to accept any reasonable offer just to escape the mounting debt. I didn't hesitate. Within 2 weeks, I owned the house where David and I had built our life together. The house he'd sold to fund his affair. The house I'd been forced to leave with nothing but heartbreak and a carload of belongings. Walking through those rooms again was surreal. The new owners had painted over my carefully chosen color schemes with bland beige walls. The garden I'd lovingly cultivated had been paved over for additional parking. The French doors in the master bedroom had been replaced with standard sliding glass doors that looked cheap and institutional. But underneath the cosmetic damage, the bones of our home remained. The kitchen where I'd cooked countless meals, the living room where we'd hosted dinner parties, the bedroom where we'd planned our future together. I spent 6 months and a considerable amount of money restoring the house to its former glory, but with improvements that reflected who I'd become. The kitchen got professional-grade appliances and a wine refrigerator. The master suite was expanded with a luxurious bathroom featuring a soaking tub and separate shower. I hired a landscape architect to create gardens that surpassed anything I could have imagined during my marriage. The house became my personal residence, but more importantly, it became a symbol. Every morning when I wake up in that master bedroom, I remember the woman who once lived there, dependent, trusting, willing to put someone else's dreams before her own security. And every evening when I return from managing my expanding business empire, I celebrate the woman I've become. Elena often jokes that I should write a book about my experience. From doormat to real estate mogul, she suggests, laughing over dinner at restaurants David could never afford. But the truth is, sharing my story feels like giving away trade secrets. Let other betrayed wives figure out their own paths to power. The real satisfaction comes from the small moments, like when I learned that David had tried to get a job with Martina's property management, not knowing who owned the company. My HR director, following my instructions, politely informed him that his references didn't meet our standards for employment. Or when Victoria called my office last year, desperately seeking affordable housing after her latest relationship ended badly. She spoke to Elena, not recognizing the voice of the woman who had once helped coordinate the destruction of her ex-boyfriend's marriage. Elena took detailed information about Victoria's housing needs, promised to call back with options, and then filed the application in the trash where it belonged. These aren't grand gestures of revenge. They're quiet demonstrations of how thoroughly the power dynamic has shifted. David and Victoria exist now in a world where I control resources they need, opportunities they want, spaces they hope to inhabit. They don't even know I'm there, pulling strings and making decisions that affect their daily lives. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came just last month. I was having lunch at an upscale restaurant in Newport Beach when I spotted a familiar figure bussing tables in the corner. David, wearing a server's uniform that had seen better days, clearing plates and refilling water glasses for customers who barely acknowledged his existence. Our eyes met across the dining room, and I saw him recognize me. The successful woman in designer clothes, dining with important clients, discussing million-dollar property deals while he scraped leftover food into plastic bins. I didn't gloat. I didn't approach him or make a scene. I simply nodded politely, as one might acknowledge any service worker, and continued my conversation about expanding Martina's property management into commercial development. That small gesture, treating him like the invisible service person he'd become, communicated everything that needed to be said about how far we'd both traveled from that day he'd announced he was selling our house. Later, my lunch companion asked if I knew the server who'd been staring at our table. An old acquaintance, I replied. Someone I used to know when I was a different person, and that's the truth David will never understand. He didn't just lose a wife when he betrayed our marriage, he lost the opportunity to grow alongside someone who was always capable of greatness. He chose to see me as a limitation rather than a partner, a burden rather than an asset. His mistake became my liberation. His betrayal became my motivation. His cruelty became my strength. The house on Maple Grove Avenue is worth twice what David sold it for, but its real value to me is immeasurable. Every night when I lock the doors of my home owned free and clear, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't just proving you don't need someone. It's proving that losing you was the biggest mistake they ever made. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.